come along with my guest and I today and explore an age of myth.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Hey guys, welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. This is the show where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. I am the author of the No Prep Game Master. It is a short little book that will take some of the pressure of running games off of you. It gives some quick tips plus some theories of my own that I have developed over running games since I was 9 years old. You can check that out at Amazon.com or DriveThruRPG.com. Now, in today's episode, my guest and I explore his new campaign setting book for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, as well as the open game license, running a Kickstarter, and much, much more. So stick around. My guest today is the designer of Age of Myth, a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons supplement, Brett Peterson. Brett, welcome to the show.
Hi, Matt. Thanks so much for having me.
Before we dive into Age of Myth, when did you first start playing Dungeons & Dragons?
Oh, goodness. I think my dad did a session with me once when I was like 7, 6, somewhere in there.
All right.
Using a super, super simplified version of the probably AD&D rules. Yeah, so a long time ago. So I remember being a little kid, getting graph paper and graphing out. We were reading Lord of the Rings as a bedtime story at the time. And so I remember trying to graph out Moria and putting a Balrog as a circle on the graph paper.
Well, there you go. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, the first time I played, I was 9. So that is really cool that your dad had you start playing when you were so young. That's great.
Yeah, playing is probably a glorification of it. I don't think there were even dice involved, so it was just mostly like exploring a shared imaginative space. It was fun, though. It was good.
Yeah, I don't think I followed the rules until I was maybe 17 or something.
That sounds about right for me, too. Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah, no kidding. All right, well, that's fantastic. Do you still play regularly, I assume?
Yeah, actually, just spent this past weekend on Saturday. We did Extra Life it's a charity gaming event for Children's Miracle Network. Oh. So my day job, the company I work for, sponsored a team and helped us raise some funds. And so I was a DM for a 14-hour 5th edition session this past Saturday. So we went through the Sunless Citadel all in one go from Tales of the Yawning Portal. It was a lot of fun.
Wow. Okay. So 14-hour session. That's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. It was, if my voice is a little shot still, that's probably why. So
okay. Okay. Yeah, I haven't done a session that long since I was probably before I was married.
Yeah. My wife was a saint to allow this one. 3 little kids at home and one on the way. She's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. No kidding. That's great. Do you play other games besides D&D or just is it mainly D&D?
So most of the groups I've had to play with, I've been introducing new players to the games. And so 5th edition's pretty lightweight, pretty easy to get into. I mean, back when I was in middle school and high school, 3rd edition had just come out. And so that was the new hot thing, right? That was what we could get a hold of. And so we mostly played 3rd edition back then. I've played a bunch of Pathfinder, experimented a little bit with other systems. I helped playtest a Monster Hunter International spin-off kind of system. I think they're in Savage Worlds, whatever GURPS, I guess, is where that runs off of. Dabbled in other systems, but D&D has been my friend group has mostly either been in D&D and Pathfinder, so I've kind of stuck to those two.
Now, do you mainly run the games?
It ends up being that way. I like playing. I spent about a year and a half just playing recently, and that was nice. It was a nice break. But then I enjoy DMing. It's almost as fun or as much fun for me to DM as it is to be a player, and that's not true for a lot of the people I play with. And so it kind of naturally becomes that I end up DMing a lot.
Something I've been asking a lot of guests, how do you prepare for a session?
Oh, good question. So when I'm doing pre-pub adventures, just because time is kind of short, if I buy a pre-pub adventure, I'll just read through it, make some notes, note a couple of things I want to change, and then run it. So for this 14-hour session, for example, we did, I knew I was going to do a dungeon crawl. I needed a frame story in case we got to a second dungeon or if we're going to game more as part of the charity thing. And so kind of made up a frame story, had a couple of characters and as NPCs in the back of my mind, pre-planned a couple of secrets I would sprinkle through, and then kind of just ran with it, right? And work those in as appropriate. For longer campaigns, I've been using a little bit of the Sly Flourish, Lazy Dungeon Master techniques. I don't like everything in that book, but I do like the 10 secrets idea, where you write down 10 secrets, you pre-plan 10 secrets to weave through the narrative. That resonated with me a lot. So I do that one fairly consistently. To plug your books a little bit, I've been reading your random table book, and there's some things I like about that. I've actually had some really good experiences rolling random treasure, especially, which surprises me. Like, I thought that would be the worst to do random things for, but having rolled a couple of random treasures, it gives me, like, especially when it comes up as an art object. If I make up a cool art object, the first art object that pops into my head, we were doing Dragon Heist about 6 months ago, and the players killed the Mind Flayer at the very beginning, like they're not supposed to. And so I had to have, a Mind Flayer is supposed to have treasure according to a certain amount, right? So I rolled the treasure tables, and he had like 6 art objects worth 250 gold pieces each or something. And so the players got a statue of Cthulhu, and a ring that has little like fishes swimming around it, and a sword made by aboleths from 2,000 years ago, which became some of their favorite items from the campaign. Like that changed the theme of the campaign in ways I had not anticipated. So using the randomness actually was something that really gave it a nice boost that I really enjoyed. So I'm experimenting with some of that too, dropping in. I haven't gone whole hog and just like hex crawl, roll up everything in random as we go, but I might experiment with some more of that later on.
I find just allowing the dice to tell the story takes the story where I would have never imagined it. And and I just like that, especially if I'm running a lot of games or something, maybe in a row, or I've done this for a long time now. So it's just like, right. I like certain things. I know certain things that I can do well, but I get into a rut, and I just maybe find myself doing the same thing over and over again, or just kind of relying on a few some tricks in my little bag that I have, my little game master kind of tools or techniques. But just having the dice then tell the story, to me, just kind of blows me, just like it just takes me in totally different directions than I would have thought of, and it keeps the game fresh for me as well.
Definitely.
And of course, I talk about that in my book, The No Prep Game Master. Allowing the dice to tell the story is key, because if the barbarian swings the axe and they miss, or the bard fails a persuasion roll, well, the dice just told the story there. So why shouldn't the dice tell the story when I'm making up treasure, or when I'm coming up with a name for an NPC or something like that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think one of the keys with that, and this is something that some people have a bad taste in their mouth from dice telling the story, because they're rolling off of very constrained dice lists.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're only choosing from 6 items, a D6 is probably not enough, right? You probably want more than 6 options for that. And so if you, for any of your listeners, if anybody has, I know I've been in that place before where I'm like, here, I'm going to roll this, like backgrounds, choosing backgrounds. Hey, I'm going to roll this set of 6 things. Yeah.
Yeah.
People are more varied than that, right? So if you had a list of 200 character traits, or 800 or whatever that personality chart is, right? So that becomes a lot more interesting. Just like I said, to take it in directions so I'm not always playing a Arcana cleric with an Eastern European accent, right? I mean, like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that is kind of the repetition on some random tables kind of gets people every once in a while. A 1d4 random table or a 1d6 random table doesn't usually get it done very well, unless there is just a very limited amount of choices to begin with.
Sure.
But still, and I know people even complain about like the 1D100 tables, that there would be repetition, math or whatever. But I think if you roll on the table like 12 times or something, you're bound to get a repeated answer. I just don't think that that's a big deal, that you can easily deal with that quickly at the table, where the table gives you much more than it's kind of taking away. Because if you're kind of prone to do the same thing over and over again, well, the table, just gave you a much wider set of options, even if it repeats every once in a while.
Exactly.
What made you make the jump then from playing or running games into designing something for a game?
Sure. So I was actually creating action figures. I've been doing a little bit of 3D modeling occasionally, and I've done that a little bit as a hobby. I was at a Renaissance festival 2 years ago-ish, year and a half. Yeah, 2 years ago now. And saw somebody walk by in full Lorica Segmentata, right? Full Roman legionary kit. So they had the whole set. And so I said, that's a figure I have never modeled before for a Dungeons and Dragons character. I was modeling figures to be 3D printed. And so I saw that. I said, that'd be interesting. I wonder how it would be to set D&D in the ancient world. And so I grew up reading Greek myths and legends, right? I had a copy of The Golden Fleece it's that blue covered copy, right? That has a bunch of other myths randomly inserted in that other characters are telling while they're going and doing the story of Jason and the Argonauts are going and doing their thing. And so kind of a kid's primer on Greek mythology that I'd loved as a kid. And so dusted off some of those memories and started researching kind of the actual myths and getting into it a little bit more seriously as an adult here, right? Mm-hmm. And what I found was, I also started researching what was out there in Dungeons and Dragons. 5th edition doesn't have much. There were a couple of things in 2nd and 3rd edition. There was like a Hollow World thing, and there were some campaign books for Rome. Mm-hmm. But at the time when I started working on it, there weren't any really 5th edition options. Now, funny story, when we finished Age of Myth, about the same time we finished it, 2 other companies released other supplements that were closer mythologically based also, not quite the same thing we were trying to do. Mm-hmm. But what interested me when we were, so it must have been, zeitgeist or something. But what interested me as I started researching was the history itself, the real history of Rome and Greece and Egypt and Babylon and Sumeria and Carthage and Assyria and the Hittite Empire and all of those. Their actual thing, like the actual cultural practices of the day, the actual beliefs in a lot of those religions were as or more fantastic than a lot of the stuff that was in Dungeons and Dragons, right? And so that was... so I found a really rich field of material, and I thought it was already going to have been pretty well, played out. That a lot of the concepts, a lot of Greek mythology stuff already is in Dungeons and Dragons, right? A lot of the monsters are already out of Greek and Roman legends or Egyptian legends, right? So I was worried that there wasn't going to be enough to do something with. Mm-hmm. But the more I got into it, the more I found just this treasure trove, this world of opportunity in terms of a cool fantasy setting. We actually, for the final book, we cut probably 95% of our optional material. So when we started writing, we made lists of hundreds of potential monsters we could write up that were from mythology with a little bit of notes about each, and hundreds of different racial options and class options that from history, right? Mm-hmm. From a very, I don't want to say it's completely from history because we're playing mythology too, but from a very grounded, like someone in this era would recognize this thing type of perspective. Way more out there than we had time to cover or room to cover, right? I mean, just without even getting duplicative, right? Without any repetition, there was a lot there that a lot there to use, which was a lot of fun. It was really refreshing. I learned a ton. It was a good excuse to research. My wife and I were able to work on this together, right? So it was a nice couple bonding experience. She ended up doing a lot of the graphic design, and I ended up doing all the writing. And so it was just fun. And then part of it too, good excuse was. One of the reasons we picked Greco-Roman mythology to start, as we started exploring, we said, well, we could do, we could do different parts of the world. We could do Norse, or we could do Irish, or we could do Greco-Roman and Mediterranean, or we could do something else. And as we were looking into it, there's tons of public domain art that's phenomenal around Greco-Roman and Egyptian mythology. And so that was a nice, as a company just starting out, that was a great opportunity for us. We said, okay, we don't need to shell out $200,000 on artists or $50,000 on artwork. We can start with really high quality stuff to illustrate this book and get it done as we're learning about all these different things. So it was like a virtuous spiral that as we got into it, it was more fun to get into. And so that's kind of what propelled us through the whole project.
The book is geared so people can play Dungeons and Dragons in the Greco-Roman world plus Egyptian. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely correct. There's a sprinkling of Carthaginian and Babylonian and Akkadian and Sumerian in there too, but mostly it's Greco-Roman and Egyptian.
Usually you'll hear some game masters say, oh, I had this idea to play in fill in the blank setting. And so they make it up and they play it as their game. What made you then say, I'm going to publish this?
Sure. So I actually, my first job out of college was working for a small e-publisher, actually running a small e-publishing house. A couple of friends and I got together and we made this little e-publishing house. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's always been, if I'm going to put in 1,000 hours of work on something, I want to get paid at least something for it. So maybe that's just mercenary on my part.
that makes sense.
So for me, it was kind of always, hey, let's start with this from a publishing angle.
So from the beginning, you were going to publish it, right?
Yeah, and honestly, that guided our design process. We were trying really hard to be compatible with other published Wizards of the Coast products, and so we wanted to make sure the stuff we were putting out there weren't too powerful, weren't weak, weren't thematically bonkers. That we would meet, that we could play within the rules that kind of Wizards of the Coast had put out with the open game license, and so that was that decision to be, hey, this is going to be published. There were some things that would have been really cool, but would have been game breaking, right? And so we had to figuring out how to balance those pieces was actually a big part of the design process, was coming up with the theme, but then making sure the mechanics were comparable to published mechanics. Not in that they were the same things, but that they were same power level, right? You could drop one of these characters in without overthrowing a party.
Maybe just give us a few examples from the book, if you could, or like, could I make Hercules? Are there demigods, or like what kind of characters and that did you come up with that were influenced by the mythology?
Sure. So Hercules and Achilles and Hercules and Achilles especially, the straight demigods are pretty hard to represent in 5th edition without breaking something, because they're so dramatically overpowered, right? Hercules has a strength of 24, basically, right? Or 30. Achilles is invulnerable, right? Except for his heel. So those two are hard, but Jason and the Argonauts were actually absolutely one of our sources of inspiration. So the kind of less deific Argonauts. So the Sons of the North Wind, the two Boreads, show up as a race in the Age of Myth book. So those two Argonauts are there. We actually have a paladin class option called Oath of the Argonaut. It's kind of a questing paladin version, kind of based on the Argonauts' experience. He took Hercules didn't show up, but Greco-Roman wrestlers and athletes did. So one thing we were struggling with was how do you make sword and sandals options for a kung fu monk? Doesn't really fit. But there is an unarmed combatant from the ancient world, and that's the Grecian Olympian wrestler, right? The Olympian athlete. Yeah. So we did a reskin of the monk class as an athlete. We took away the wisdom piece of it because the Greek mythologies don't have those athletes being particularly wise, and replace it with like magical constitution. So they use vigor instead of ki, right? And so we kind of redid the class as a athlete class instead, with a wrestler, subclass option. We took my personal favorite class to play in 5th edition is the Warlock. I just think that thematically they're cool and mechanically they're a lot of fun. And so we have a Warlock who's made a pact with the Fates and who can manipulate chance and time. We have a Warlock who's made a pact with the Gorgons, who can work with petrification and like corroding people's souls. We had one of the ones, the wizard ones, that was more closely tied to history. Zoroastrianism arises about that era. It's actually a really old religion. And so while trying to be respectful to the actual current day Zoroastrian religion, we took a couple of things from it and made the school of the Magi, which is a wizard school that I don't want to say, hopefully in a respectful way, references some of the myths about Zoroastrians from that era. But I wouldn't say it actually uses their true beliefs, because we're trying to be respectful, but things that people thought about Zoroastrians around that time is more what it references. So it's a couple of different options. We pulled in the Greek hoplite, so spear and shield fighter. There's a specialist there. We pulled in unarmed barbarians, the Bacchantes, and they're worshiping Bacchus. They go crazy and they rip things apart with their bare hands. They show up there. Kind of a lunatic barbarian that, again, Hercules, right? Hercules goes nuts at some points and kills his kids and kills his wife, and because the gods make him crazy, right? So we said, okay, what would be an insane barbarian look like? What is a lunatic? So we made a lunatic in there, and we just had a lot of fun with it. I think there's 26 or 30 options altogether. And so there's a good smattering across all the different classes and options.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Now, so that was some of the classes. What about races?
Sure. We wanted to cover at least the basics. So you'll see centaurs and satyrs and minotaurs in there, of course. It was actually kind of funny. As we were prepping for the Kickstarter, Wizards of the Coast came out with an Unearthed Arcana prior to Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica coming out, of minotaurs and centaurs and satyrs. We're like, well, okay, stink. But they took them in a different direction. They were actually fairly thematically different, because they were doing Magic the Gathering, Ravnica, centaurs and minotaurs, and we were doing something quite different. So we covered those basics, but then we also covered some ones that are actually in the myths, but people aren't as familiar with. So there's a race of myrmidons. So there's a Ares' son gets trapped on an island, and he prays to his father, and Ares turns a bunch of ants into his subjects for him. So there's this race of people that were once ants, right, called myrmidons. And they show up a couple other times throughout the mythology. So we have myrmidons in there. They have like limited telepathy, and they ride giant ants into battle and so forth. We threw in, there's one that's actually quite difficult to pronounce, autochthones, which are people from the earth. In Greek mythology, when the blood of Titans falls onto the ground, a race of people springs up from that. And so we have them in there. They're kind of drama queen dwarves, basically. They're super passionate, super flighty, super emotional dwarves, kind of like the stereotypical Like if you read through the Greek myths, sometimes they seem to modern readers a little bit melodramatic. We were trying to go for that with the autochthones, right? So we have that race in there. We have the flying humans, the Boreads, that we talked about. We have a couple options. We wanted some like a Roman type of race. So we have these wolf people, Lupercalians, and they're based on Rome. We have a set of, I mentioned satyrs and centaurs. The Greeks actually had a lot of the Greek natural histories, like Pliny's natural history. They were early stabs at anthropology, but there was a lot of folklore mixed in. So you get these really like kind of strange accounts of people who don't have heads, where their faces are on their chest, and people who have dog heads, and people who have only one foot. Some of those were a little weird even for us, right? We said, yeah, dog, 1 foot, yeah, that's going to be not so interesting to play. Face in your chest, that's a little funky. Not sure we're going to do that one. But hey, dog-headed people, jackal-headed people, we can work that into the D&D universe, right? So like we have these as like precursors to jackal-weirs, basically. Jackal-weirs are fallen members of this race that are dog-headed. We have we took the biblical story of ancient Egypt about the plagues of Egypt. I said, what if the curse of frogs was, instead of frogs coming up out of the river and being bothersome to people in Egypt, what if the Egyptians got turned into frogs? So we have a race of former humans, now frogs, called Lirani, right? And so kind of spaced them out. So our jackal-headed people are based loosely on the sea people. Our frog people are based loosely on the Egyptians. We have the Lupercalians based on Rome. We have the autochthones based on Greece. A couple of centaurs and minotaurs and satyrs and boreads, and I'm missing one that I'm going to kick myself for later.
Oh, no problem.
Thanks.
Between classes and races, those are a lot of different options. And you also created some new backgrounds as well.
Yeah, we wanted to have something that, like, we were thinking through what would it take to let a player immerse themselves in this setting, right? And so spells are actually fairly easy. I feel like spells are, as a DM, are fairly easy to refluff. You describe the effects appropriate for the setting, right? And they're also terribly hard to balance. So we wanted to kind of stay away from that one. Feats are the same way. The feats that they describe are relatively universal. They don't require a lot of setting specific stuff. But backgrounds, a guild artisan, right? Yeah, okay, you can fudge it, but that doesn't really fit the idea of like an Egyptian weaver, right? That's different. So we wanted to have something that was much more grounded in the setting for backgrounds especially. So we have things like oracles and amulet makers and priestesses and priests. We have Vestal virgins and their male counterpart, the Katiste, that show up in there. We have archons from Greek society that show up as part of a background. So very, very, not that they're tied to a specific, some of them are tied to specific nations, but they're definitely tied to an era of the world, right? Where like, we had frankly a 2,000-year period to play with, roughly. And so we wanted to have backgrounds that really jived with that level of technology, that level of social organization, that those types of political structures and units and things that were there, those lifestyles. So we have, vintners and brewers and things you expect to see if you're in an ancient Roman city.
The book also includes some mini adventures, right? Those just to help people get started when they get the book. Yeah,
exactly. One of the things I've found with, I think, role-playing games in general, too, that's pretty hard for new players especially, is they front-load all of their complexity, right? So right at the beginning, you have to go through all the complexity of making a character. And as a new DM, right at the beginning, you have to go through all the complexity of creating a new world and adventure. Like all the hardest stuff is right at the front, right? And it's still fun, no complaints, but just that can be difficult for people to get into it. So we wanted to give a couple options that somebody could just say, hey, we're going to drop in these little mini adventures. And I was kind of thinking too that you could drop them in as if you want to play with a standard D&D set, somebody could be teleported back in time, and they find themselves in one of these adventures, or these are little pockets of the ancient world that survived through the medieval times, if you want to do it that way in a normal campaign. But the ones we wrote and included in the book really takes you from level 1 about through level 6. That you can have these little mini adventures and level up through a decent chunk of the campaign. It's a good skeleton for a campaign. It's not a complete campaign from levels 1 to 6, but it's a good starting point. So we were hoping we could give some enough bones that would be easy for a new player, a new DM to connect together and put some meat around. All of them are actually built around a theme about dealing with the underworld. And so my wife and I have talked about someday we may do a pre-pub campaign of our own where we do that job, right? Where we connect all the different pieces and flesh it out from levels 1 to 16 or something. And but you'll see in the 4 adventures. The first one is about fleeing the fall of Atlantis, basically. The second one is about trying to get into the underworld to rescue someone who's perished in that regard. The third one is about dealing with Egyptian mummified animals who are bridging that gap, right? And shouldn't be. And the fourth one is about interacting with priestesses who can help you get into the underworld or tell you how to get there if you need to. And so those are kind of all around, just like mythological stories where the hero goes into the underworld and comes back up. That's kind of how we were taking that campaign. What would we do? What's the mythic structure? That's probably descend into the underworld and then return.
That is always part of kind of the hero's journey. They have to descend into the underworld and then return.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm a big fan of Campbell. So yeah. Exactly that.
Well, even Aragorn, right? Aragorn has to go. Yeah. Has to do the same thing. No, it sounds fantastic. I guess, let me just ask some other questions. I know there are people in my audience who are considering running a Kickstarter. So you Kickstarted this book. What was kind of your experience like that, and how did things go? So
with the book, we went in knowing it was going to be a labor of love, right? So I want to put that out there first, is that while there are $1 million role-playing game Kickstarters, there are about 3 of them, right? So we it was funny because, I mean, as ambitious as we are, we knew it was going to be labor of love, but we said, hey, let's still try to model off of the most successful ones. So we looked at Matthew Colville's campaign and kind of tried to model that very specifically. That was probably a blunder on our part, because we don't have 100,000 viewers, subscribers on YouTube who already think we're cool and think we're a brand, right?
Yeah.
So there was a real disconnect in how we were engaging, what we were doing. Sometimes we didn't think through quite all the way what we were making. We just kind of followed in someone else's footsteps. And I would recommend against that. So Matthew Colville, for example, has T-shirts because he's got a brand and a following and a tribe, right? Mm-hmm. We sold T-shirts, and I think we sold 10 of them, right? I mean, it was like, they were cool T-shirts, but nobody cares, right? That was not a thing.
Yeah.
So there was that. First was maybe thinking through what we wanted to offer a little bit more. When we did the campaign, we planned out things we would like to see, things that we thought would be cool with the books. We had a GM screen and the books and a premium edition, and pawns, and class and monster pawns, and campaign maps that you could get, and then the little stickers is kind of a low-level low-level pledge, and then something else. Anyway, we went with it, right? The PDF for the book, yes.
Sure.
And so we wanted to. That's not a bad set. So we planned out the ideas. We figured we could get. We were looking at the margins in those. We got some preliminary quotes from a printer to make sure we were pricing it. We weren't going to get stung on the pricing anyway, right? Mm-hmm. And then we just kind of launched. I think what would have, and we paid for a bunch of advertising too. We did take some of those images we had and prepped some advertising material and launched. One thing I think we did well was we actually didn't write the whole book before we launched. Right? Mm-hmm. One of the things, we didn't know how well it was going to go. So if we only sold $1,000 worth of books, then we didn't want to write an extra 200 pages that nobody was going to pay extra for. Right? If nobody cared, don't waste your time. Right? So part of the advantage of Kickstarter is once you get enough together to have a good product, something solid, all the bonuses and all the extras and bells and whistles can be stretch goals, right? So our book about doubled, maybe increased in length by about 150% as a result of stretch goals, which was fun, and that was a blast, and people wanted it, and that was good validation, right? But I think that was a good thing that we didn't have everything written. Now that did mean it took us the full year to fulfill our books, like we told our backers it would, right? We told them it may take us up to a year, and it did, right? So I think we are, for 5 of the backers, we're going to be behind by a week, but all the rest were delivered on time, or shipped on time. So there were some benefits there. I'll talk about advertising. We did the advertising, and we tried like Board Game Geek and the EN World and a couple of like game-specific sites and Facebook. I know other game designers have had better luck on those game-specific sites. We just didn't see the ROI from it. Basically, all of our return came from Facebook, which makes me sad because I wanted to support other community sites, right? I'd rather work on Board Game Geek and EN World and that kind of stuff, but we just didn't see the traffic from them that we'd hoped for. What we did see traffic from, though, were when we had write-ups from like reviewers from the open game store, from the D20 Pathfinder system reference document guys, those guys. Yeah. They did a review for us on a couple of sites, and that drove a lot of traffic. And so like reaching out and getting individual conversations, that was awesome. Paid advertising basically was from Facebook, right? So that was our experience. I know other game designers have better luck other places, but that was kind of what we saw. I would really recommend, if somebody's looking at doing a Kickstarter, though, start advertising early, like a month or two before. We didn't. We basically started advertising when the campaign went live. I think that was a major mistake on our part, especially for some of these other sites, because by the time somebody saw it, it was already over, right? Or it was the end of the campaign. And so we lost a lot of that pre-buzz that we should have been generating.
I know there's a lot of moving pieces involved with running a Kickstarter, so it's interesting to hear from hear your perspective. So the campaign was successful, and it all worked out for you, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but let me go back to that labor of love, right? We probably ended up, when everything is all said and done, we probably ended up breaking about even on the campaign. So, which is fine. That was fun. We did it because it was fun. We were enjoying it as a couple's project, right? And we're trying to build it was our first product. We were trying to put our name out there. Right when we were about to launch our campaign, another book called Arcadia, which again is a little bit different than ours, a little bit different approach than ours, came out at the same time, and they had frankly a better run campaign, and so they came up with about 30,000, I think, compared to our 6, which is fine. They did great work. And then right after our campaign, an Italian company made their own full tabletop game, and they raised like $200,000 from the European market, right? Okay. But they also, it was like their third release, and they had already done a $10,000 campaign and a $60,000 campaign, and this became a $200,000 campaign. So we ended up competing against larger players in the market that we hadn't expected, which was fine. That's life, right? So given the circumstances, I think it went pretty well. What has been really cool is our backers have been awesome, right? They've been really cool to work with. They're very supportive. We didn't update them as much as we should have. Like monthly updates at minimum would be better. We ended up being like bi-monthly, quarterly updates sometimes, and that was a little light, unfortunately. But they've been really supportive and really enthusiastic, which has just been a lot of fun. But yeah, I would say your first campaign, our plan is, hey, we did this first campaign. We're going to deliver a solid product. We're pleased with our work. We'll put it on our web store and put it in DriveThruRPG. And then our next campaign, if we do another one of these, people will have some history with us. Right? People will know what to expect. We'll know which printers we can work with that work, which shipping companies we work with. One thing I would say too, I would not try to work with international ship or printers right out of the gate. Like if you ship around the world, absolutely, for your books. But if you think you're going to negotiate printing in Australia, for example, or China or Europe, you can do it. But man, is that a lot of work. And if there's problems, it's a lot of work to fix. And so I would recommend whatever country you're in, start there, ship everywhere, right? That's going to lower some of your pledges, right? We got a lot of Australian pledges, and Australian gamers are awesome. But we ended up taking a beating because we couldn't get our Australian book printer to work. And so we're going to ship the books to Australia and eat the value-added tax ourselves, which is the right thing to do for our customers. That's totally fine. But as a founder, as a business owner, be careful with that.
I guess just kind of picking up on the business side, since nowadays anybody can self-publish anything.
Right.
What are some of your thoughts on? I know I talked to a number of people who are out there just saying, well, how do you self-publish? How do you do this? What would just be some kind of key if somebody is wanting to just publish a campaign, say they've been running for a while?
What I would say is everybody can self-publish, but the steps to produce a quality product are the same. So what's really changed is not publishing, but distribution. Yeah. So anybody can distribute on their own. There's platforms like even Amazon and Kickstarter and Indiegogo and just putting up your own website and publishing. That is now democratized. Mm-hmm. And you can hire your own printer and get it printed yourself. And there's print on demand that's democratized some of that too. But all the steps in the publishing process, writing the thing, editing it, art direction, layout, design, proofreading, playtesting, all of that, you still have to go through, or risk having an inferior quality product, right? So I would really recommend to everybody, you don't have to be able to do all those things yourselves. I'd worked in publishing before, so I had some exposure to this. My wife has done editing and graphic design before, so we had a fairly solid combo ourselves. But there were some things we hired outside editors for, right? We brought in copy editors at the beginning, or top-level editors, not copy editors, the other ones, content editors, to say, hey, are we thematically on base with some of these, right? Or is this correct? We still need to play test. You can't do that yourselves. You have to get outside your own head for that. Mm-hmm. And so if you can't do it yourself, that's fine, but you probably will have to pay somebody to do it or share an equity with them, right? So I would just recommend for anybody thinking about doing a Kickstarter or thinking about self-publishing, I would say absolutely go for it. That's awesome. But just know you're going to need to learn how to do it, or you're going to need to pay somebody to do it in order to get a good result.
You had mentioned earlier the OGL, which of course is the open game license.
Right.
And this is something that I get questions on all the time. And there's just seems to be a lot of confusion around the open game license. Now, the open game license was released by Wizards of the Coast, and it just kind of spells out what legally people can do when they're creating their own content. How did you kind of navigate that?
So before I say this, I need to put a cover my tail statement out there. I am not a lawyer. So
neither am I. Yeah, neither am I. So, yes.
Exactly. So
absolutely.
It should not be construed as legal advice.
Yes, absolutely.
But how we interpreted the OGL was, when I read through it, my kind of boiled down takeaway was that you can use the rules and you can use the things that are in the open game license itself. But if you use those things, then the things you create are also open game license. That said, the stuff that is not from those things is not open game license. You can have that be product identity, right? Which is how Wizards of the Coast kept hold of Beholders, for example, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Beholders, and there's a couple other ones, but Beholders is the big one.
Displacer Beast, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Just call it a queryal and take it from A. Van Vogt, who actually came up with the idea in the first place, and you're fine, right? But that's, yeah. So that's how we kind of bifurcated it and said, okay, so here's things we can use that are free. Here's things that we can't, that we're going to have. For our purposes, we wanted to maintain copyright ownership. We saw one of the things that we really didn't like with the DMs Guild, for example, which gives you access to a lot more stuff, right? Yeah. You can place your stuff in the Forgotten Realms with the DMs Guild. Mm-hmm. But there were two problems with that. First, we were running a setting, so that didn't work. Yeah. And second, in the DMs Guild, Wizards of the Coast can take you are signing to them the right to sell anything you give them without compensating you, right? They don't own your intellectual property. They have an unlimited right to use it without compensation, right? Again, I like to get paid for stuff. So to me, that seemed like a raw deal, right? That didn't seem like a very good setup for me. So we went with the more restrictive open game license, which says, okay, you can't use Elminster or Forgotten Realms figures. You can't actually set it in the Forgotten Realms. You have to be careful with Dungeons and Dragons specific deities, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But you own the content, you own the IP. So that's so for us, we instead of talking about Goblin Maglibiet, a goblin god, right? We talked about how there are gods that fight for control of the underworld, right? Which is true in ancient Greek mythology too. That's not copyrightable or trademarkable, right? Keeping it that generic makes it very easy for a dungeon master who's playing with a Forgotten Realms kind of setting to make those connections without running afoul of copyright. At least we hope. Hopefully Wizards of the Coast doesn't sue us for the result of this interview.
Well, hopefully that doesn't happen. Yeah, I was just getting some questions recently about the difference between the DMs Guild and just releasing your own product. And I think when I was reading it, I think if Wizards of the Coast takes something from DMs Guild and uses it in an official product, they have to compensate the person.
Okay.
Yes, the DMs Guild, you cannot do an original setting, but you could do Forgotten Realms, Greyhawk. And so in that case, you can use all of their artwork, which is amazing and everything like that. But yes, if you do your original setting, you are outside that, and you can't even mention the word Dungeons and Dragons.
Right. So one way you can tell all kinds of the OGL stuff, open game license stuff, is you'll say 5e, right, or 5th edition, right? Because none of us can use Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah,
exactly. That's the way I did it in my one campaign setting. It just says 5e on it. It can be used with 5e, and because you can't even say compatible with or something like that. So you just have to say 5e or 5th edition or something like that.
And that one is for other people doing publishing. I would really recommend don't play games with Wizards of the Coast's lawyers, right? Like don't challenge them on that unless you have deeper pockets than I do, or unless you're a lawyer yourself, right? Like
absolutely.
Be careful however you interpret it. Be careful with that interpretation. Stick to it.
Yeah, and hopefully they would just send a cease and desist letter, and you can just stop or something. But, yes, but I mean the OGL is quite fascinating because so many companies have released things under that you can just gather together if you follow, say, some of the companies, what is it, Fat Goblin and Games and Frog God Games and stuff. If you gathered together all of the content that is available in the OGL, you could make something amazing. So I mean, just incredible. There is just so much content out there that is absolutely free to use. It's just you do have to read some legalese and just make sure you get maybe some advice from somebody who knows what they're doing. Which maybe I don't.
Well, and that's actually I would put a word of warning in that, because like for our book, anything that's listed as product identity is still copyrighted. So a lot of Kobold Press, for example, they are really careful about, they're using the OGL, but no one can use any of their stuff, as far as I interpret it, because it's all product identity. So like for our stuff, we still copyrighted our work. It's not for free to anybody to use.
Sure.
It's still our copyright. It's not intellectual property, except in the places where it overlaps with what Wizards of the Coast has already put out. So like spell lists, for example, like if we're listing spells from the OGL, well, I mean, okay, those aren't ours anyway, right? Yeah. But so just be careful if you're republishing stuff. It might be worth the $200 consultation fee with a lawyer, right? Just to run through it.
Yeah. There's a section. There's a large section of text, which is the OGL copyright text, and there is one section in that I can't remember the number. It's like section 15 or something. But if you go into that section, the company should tell you everything that is released into the OGL within that one section. I can't remember if that's the exact section or whatever, but they should tell you everything that's released there. So you should be able to get an idea of that. But again, always make sure you're reading everything for yourself. Exactly like I did with mine. I have, some story elements and fictional elements that are certainly my IP, but I made some creatures and things that fit into my world. Those are completely OGL, and anybody could take those and use them, and that's fine, because I basically just took other OGL creatures and just modified them slightly. So, and so that's kind of the way it goes. Brett, I've been having a blast talking to you about this stuff. Where can people find you, and where can people find the book?
Yeah, great question. So they can find us on knucklebones.net. The company is Knucklebones Publishing. Knucklebones.net, KNUCKLEBONES.net. And then our products will also be available on DriveThruRPG in both print and PDF format. So you'll see some stuff on that. They can also find me on LinkedIn or on Facebook. We have a Knucklebones on Facebook page. That should be pretty available. Our next product and campaign will be coming out probably at the end of January. We're going to be doing a set of custom dice to kind of go along with any kind of role-playing game, really, but fantasy settings especially. So we'll have those coming out. So see us on Kickstarter too, and and then we're starting to get into local conventions and a couple other places. So hopefully people in St. Louis at least can see us around.
Well, Brett, thank you so much for being on the show, and I will link up Age of Myth and your website in the show notes for this episode. So thank you for being on the show today.
Matt, thank you so much for having me. It was a blast.
Well, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation with Brett today. As I mentioned, I have provided links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. You can find The Age of Myth as well as his publishing company website, so you can check out exactly what we were talking about today. If you like free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You will get 10 free dungeon maps, and you will also never miss an episode of this show. Also, if you enjoy these interviews, please head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and consider supporting the podcast there. Every bit of support that I get on Patreon just lets me know that I should keep producing episodes of this show. I thank you so much for listening, and until next time, keep gaming.